People love having stuff made for them, whether it's breakfast or some kitchen tools to help. So today, let's focus on the latter and make some gifts that are sure to be a hit on Timber Biscuit. Alright, so about a year ago I made a video about simple woodworking projects for gifts, and this is our part 2. So we'll kick it off with the knife block you saw in the opening sequence. And for these gifts, I'm going to be using walnut and bloodwood as an accent. They're two of my wife's favorite stocks, and since these gifts are for her, I figure I better stick with what she likes. Plus, you can never go wrong with using walnut. So once I had my stocks milled flat, I took the bloodwood over to the bandsaw to resaw it. Now this stock is incredibly dense, so I didn't want to have to take a bunch of passes at the planer to get it to the final thickness. Plus, because I'm resawing, it'll give me 2 panels to work with for my divider strips. So once I had my pieces to their final thickness, I took them over to the table saw to cut them to their final length. And it's important to note here that I'm leaving the divider stock a little long so that I can flush trim it once everything's glued up later on. So with my ripping blade installed, I could go ahead and start ripping out those divider strips. And these will just be thin strips that'll sit on either side of the knife blade to hold the knife in place. Plus they have the added benefit of giving some contrast to the piece, which in the end will look really cool. Alright, so with all my strips cut out, I could trim out my larger pieces into 4 blanks over at the bandsaw. And I'm using my bandsaw here rather than my table saw only to conserve some material. The overall dimensions I need are just over 3 inches wide, and my boards were about 6¼ inches, so I had to conserve as much as I could. So once I had my 4 blanks cut out, I could go ahead and lock down the fence and cut out a sled. This will be the sled I use to cut the tapers to give us that flared look. So once I had my angle set with my bevel square, I marked that out on the sled, and then marked the start and stop point for my cut. From there I could just attach an offcut to act as a fence for my tapers. Now it's important to use some thicker stock here to make sure that it can support the piece while it's being cut. If not, you risk the piece moving while you're cutting, and then at the end, things won't line up, kind of like pineapple on pizza. But hey, no judgment here. Alright, so once I attached the rear stop, all I need to do is attach a hold down clamp, and we're good to go. So next I can take the whole sled back over the bandsaw and cut out my tapers. Here I was just really careful to make sure that I had enough room for my hold down clamp to clear the blade. And I also stuck an added piece of MDF to the opposite side to make sure that the workpiece stayed flat throughout the cut. Once I had 1 taper cut, I just rotated the blank and cut the second taper out of the block. This gives me 2 tapers per blank, which is perfect because for this knife block I need 7. And we'll hold on to that 8th one for one of the projects we have later on in the video. And if you don't have a bandsaw, you could cut these over at the table saw. It would just require 2 passes over the blade for each cut because your table saw blade height won't cut all the way through the block. So it's just a little trickier. So with those cuts done, it was time to give everything a quick sanding. And because sanding's not the most exciting thing in the world, we'll go ahead and speed through that. Alright, so now that we have all our pieces sanded, we can go ahead and start assembling. So the first thing I wanted to do was mark out my orientation. And here I'm keeping that 90-degree angle on the bottom of all of them to keep a nice consistent look. Once I had all my wedges numbered, I started laying in the dividers. Now for the dividers, you're really going to have to think about the knives that you have, or the knives that the person you're making it for has, or just shoot for your more standard sizes. I divided the bottom row into 2 different sections so that it could hold 2 smaller knives. The 4 areas above will only get dividers on either side so they can hold much wider blades. The top section does have a bit of an offset to fit 1 medium-sized knife and 1 small knife. And don't worry about the knives rattling around, we'll address that in a second. And I do this in sections while using a combination of wood glue and CA glue so that the pieces stay in place while the wood glue dries. Oh, and before I forget, if you want the plans for this project or any of the other projects in this video, be sure to check out the description. Alright, so back to the build. So if you remember earlier, I said I left those dividers long, and that was so that I could flush trim them just like this once they were all in place. Since pieces can move during glue ups, it's definitely a good idea to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, and leaving these long does just that. And speaking of wiggle room, next it was time to address those wiggly knives. And my solution for that is just to glue in a small rare earth magnet. This should sit below the surface so that it doesn't scratch up the knives, but it'll give a nice hold to the knives to make sure they don't jiggle around in the knife block. While most knife blocks just use gravity to hold the knives in place, the design of this block allows some of the knives to sit flat, so we want to make sure that those guys stay put. And since this magnet sits deep enough that it'll just hit the blade, it'll counterbalance the weight of the handle, stopping the blade from tipping. Because there's nothing worse than thinking you've secured a sharp object, only to have it jump back out at you and cut your hand. Not that that's ever happened. Alright, so now that the magnets were in place, I could start attaching the sections together. This time, however, I only needed to use wood glue. And to clamp everything together, I used 2 offcuts to offset the angle on my taper. This way I could get good clamping pressure. I then just repeated this process until I had all my sections together. This process did take a little patience, but honestly, woodworking minus patience equals firewood. So I just took my time to get things to line up as best I could. Once I divided and conquered that, it was time to clamp up everything into one large sandwich and let it dry. From there I could just use my random orbit sander to clean up any of the offsets that were created during the glue ups. Now to get a nice curved edge on the knife entryway, I just use my random orbit sander and smooth out a subtle curve. This is more feel than an exact measurement, I just want to make sure that things look nice and smooth. As for the other end, I just use my spindle sander to give it a matching radius. If you don't have a spindle sander, you could use a wooden dowel wrapped in some sandpaper to get the same effect. And if you've enjoyed this video so far, be sure to give it a like so it can spread to more people. Thanks for your support. Alright, so with that one just about wrapped up, let's move on to the towel rack. And my first step here was to mill my pieces down to their final thickness. Now I'm going to leave these a little wider than they actually need to be for my final piece so that I can trim it back as a full box later on. But I'll talk more about that when we get there. Next I need to cut 2 square edges onto the end of my sticks. This way I have a square edge to reference against for my horizontal pieces. And to cut those out, I'll just set a stop on my miter gauge. From there I could use my crosscut sled to cut out the sides and center divider. I prefer using a crosscut sled over a miter gauge for small cuts like this way I can avoid my fingers being near the blade. It's also not a bad idea to use a hold down clamp so that you can ensure that your workpiece stays in place and doesn't shift while making the cut. The joinery for this towel rack is going to be finger joints, and that's because they're going to add a little bit of visual interest as well as structural integrity to the downward force that a towel rack will see. So I've made a short on how to build a finger joint jig, but just in case you missed it, here's a quick recap. The most important part of any finger joint jig is to dial in your spacing. You want to make sure that the width of your dado stack is the exact width of the pin on your finger joint jig. Here I'll be going with 1/4 inch, but if you want to use wider or thinner pins, just adjust your dado stack and your pin accordingly. Alright, so now that we're all caught up, what I'm doing here is setting the width that I just spoke about. Now this does take a little trial and error, so make sure that you have a few offcuts to test your fit. If it's too tight, move the pin closer to the blade, and if it's too loose, move it further away. But once you do have it dialed in, it's pretty simple. To start the cut on the joint, we want to use that pin as a stop and then make our first pass over the blade. From there we just lift the piece, putting the pin into the notch, and then make the next cut. And we repeat this process until we can't go any further. Oh, and if you're not using a dado stack, just make sure to do this with a flat bottom blade. To cut the adjoining side, we just rotate our first workpiece 180 degrees and drop it onto the pin. This will create a gap in that first notch of our side piece, and then we just basically repeat the same process again. Once we've cut all of our notches into that side, we can flip the piece 180 degrees and repeat our process. When cutting box joints, I like to cut my front first, then my 2 sides, and then the back. This way I have a better visual of which side I want to face out on the back and which side I want to face in. Just remember that the front and back pieces should have matching notches, and that your 2 sides will have matching notches as well. Alright, so the last piece to align before we do the glue up is the center divider. And to do that, I just use a rule to mark the center, and we'll just clamp this guy in place. There's really no need for any added joinery here, so again, we'll just keep things simple. Kind of like Forrest Gump's password, you know, 1 Forrest 1. Alright, so while this towel rack hangs out to dry, let's get started on the tongs. So to get started, I ripped down 2 strips so that I could create my tong squeezers, or grabbers, or whatever you call them. So once I had my 2 strips cut out, I ran them through the planer to thickness them down to 3/16 of an inch. That should give them enough rigidity for a good sized tong, but if you go with a super long set, they may weaken a bit. So once I had them to their final thickness, I taped my 2 pieces together to ensure that they were the same length, and this will also help with the end profile that we'll do in a minute. Once I set my bandsaw fence to the width of my tongs, I went ahead and cut down that extra wedge that we had from the knife block. We'll now use this piece to create the wedge for our tongs. So as you'll recall, the bottom of this wedge is 90 degrees, and we don't want that. So I used an offcut to create the mirrored edge we're looking for, and then cut it out over the bandsaw. Now when cutting your wedges, I think it's an opportunity to have a little fun. You could go with some longer wedges, or some thinner wedges, or even some steeper angles. It's really up to you. Since my vision for these tongs is more of like a salad serving set, I'm going to go ahead and round over just one corner of the ends. But you could opt to round over both ends, or not round over any at all. Again, do whatever you like. Alright, so once I finished rounding over the tips of the disc sander, I went ahead and sanded the remaining pieces up to 220. Then it was time for some glue. And I really like a set of wooden clamps for this operation, because they can be angled and they don't slip off as easily. But to stop the wedge from shooting down the handle, I went ahead and clamped in a piece of MDF. Without this piece in place, the wedge would definitely slip out. So once my glue had set up, I cut in some slots for some keys. Now these are completely optional, but I have that bloodwood sitting around, so I figured I may as well use it. And while they're not adding any structure to the tongs, I think they add some visual interest and makes them look a little cooler. So I just clamp the tongs to one of my offcuts and run it vertically over the blade. And once my keys are thickness down to the correct size, I just glue them in place. And we're looking for a somewhat snug fit here, but not so tight that they need to be tapped in with a mallet or anything. So once the glue was dry, I could cut the excess off the keys at the bandsaw. Now again here, you could use a flush trim saw if you don't have a bandsaw. Just make sure that you cut in towards the tongs, not out and away from them, so you don't tear out the keys. From there, just use my random orbit sander clamped in a vise to sand everything flush. Now I have a few strips left over, so I'm going to make a few toaster tongs with my remaining pieces. And these tongs are super fast to make, so get ready. So first we want to trim out our blocks to about 1.25 inches by say 7 inches. Then we're going to use a 1-inch Forstner bit to drill a hole through the center. This hole should be placed about 1 inch from the top edge. Otherwise it'll snap and we don't want that to happen. So once we've got our hole punched through the center of the top of our tongs, we're going to take the piece over to the bandsaw and remove the waste from the middle. Now my fence is just set at 1/4 inch here, and I'm just making one straight cut through each side, and when we're done, we'll have a pair of tongs. Now as an added option, you could add a small magnet to the back of these tongs so that they could stick to the toaster. I didn't do that here because I was out of magnets. Alright, so now that our box joints have had plenty of time to set up, I'm going to go ahead and remove that excess waste. And I start by using a random orbit sander just to knock down the really high edges. Then I come back with a hand plane to really flatten out those joints. So earlier in the video I mentioned that I left these pieces a little wide. And that was so that I could flush trim them here at the table saw once the box was all assembled. This squares everything up, plus I get to remove that extra pin, and I think the final piece looks a lot nicer that way. And hey, if you enjoy these videos and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, an invite to the Discord server, and some other free stuff. And I'm always looking for new ways to get you guys involved with the projects I'm doing, so be sure to check it out. The link will be in the description. And for those of you who've already joined, as always, thank you so much for your support. The final step for these pieces was the finish. And for that I'm going to use some butcher block oil on the pieces that are going to come in contact with food and food utensils. And for the towel rack, I'll just use a penetrating oil. If you're looking for links to the items and products I've used in this video, I'll have them linked down in the description. Now full disclosure, I do get a few pennies if you do buy, but I would never recommend anything I don't use myself. So once the 2 coats of finish were dry on all my pieces, I went ahead and applied some rubber feet to the bottom of the butcher block. Then I attached some heavy duty hooks to the back of the towel rack. Now these hooks are the same ones I used on the coat rack a few years ago, so I know their quality and they're not going to tear out. And once those hooks were in place, these guys were ready for a bow. I'm really happy with how these simple woodworking gifts came together. This wasn't an overbearing build by any means, and it was a lot of fun to make these small projects for my wife, who I know is going to love them. So if you're looking for a simple gift for a friend or loved one, definitely consider making them one of these. Or better yet, make all of them. Or if you're looking to earn a little money, these things will do great at craft shows. Either way, create what you like and have fun doing so. And in the meantime, if you want to see more videos like this one, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.